Yo, let me show you where Arkhein motion actually came from. Now, if you're the type who's great at planning, great at ideas, but your life still feels, stuck in neutral, then this is for you. For the longest time, that was me. I knew how to plan vision boards, right? Notion dashboards, YouTube game plans, gym routines, what else? Workout routines. I could map all of it. But my real life, for example, my habits, my financial, my money, of course, right? My health and consistency, they weren't matching what was in my head. So, and that tension between high clarity and low movement is where Arkhein motion was born. It just started in random places, like these custom Jordan 1s mochas I made. I'd be up like 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. for this, obsessing over tiny details on this pair of mocha ones, like how the colors should talk to each other, like how I wanted, everything to be balanced out, and, how the texture should hit when the light catches them. And or I'd be locked into some digital illustration, like for example this one, drawing this floating character, like trying to capture that weird space between motion and stillness, like just trying to express everything that I couldn't speak out publicly, you know what I mean? Or I'd be out doing street photography, like reading the street, watching how people move, their emotions, their behaviors, and like how the train, the walls, and the sidewalk all create one path through the frame. And one day it hit me. I could give that much attention to how a shoe moves, how a drawing flows, or how a stranger crosses a street. But I wasn't giving that much attention to how I moved through my own life. I wasn't short on ambition, but I was actually short on honest motion. So I started taking notes, not goals. Just what actually happened in the moment before I move or freeze. Like what I'm telling myself right before I back out. What does my body do? What is my environmental, making easy or making impossible? And those messy little notes slowly turned into structure. And that structure is now what I call Arkhein motion. Then the name came. I kept seeing two things. There's always a hidden origin behind the way we move, right? And like for example, old fears, quiet expectations, rules we wrote for ourselves like years ago, and those unseen rules end up governing our own visible actions, right? So I dug into an old root, right, and which is Arkhein, which means to begin, to rule, and to lead. And I kept the sound, but bent it into my own form. Now, Arkhein means the inner origin and quiet rules behind your movement. And motion is, of course, the visible way you actually move through your day, right? Then I just basically put them together, Now, Arkhein motion is the way your unseen origin becomes real world motion, and how you learn to rule that motion instead of like being ruled by it. But before you can change how you move, you have to see how you move, right? So here's a simple version. Like most of us live inside this wide gap, right? Between what we know and what we actually do. So we got the notes, the vision, the tutorials, and the routines, right? Then when it's time to move, we feel tension in our chest. Like we open our phone and we tell ourselves like, I'm not just ready yet. Sounds responsible, but underneath that, it's just like, I just don't want this to hurt, right? But in Arkhein sight starts with a different question. Like, what am I really protecting myself from by staying still? And here is how I break that down. Like every time you face something that matters, like for example, posting, applying, speaking up, changing a habit, 3 layers hit you at once. Story, signal, and setup. When I was customizing this Jordan 1s, I had a story in my head about what that shoe needed to say without any words. My signal was that feeling in my chest when the design finally clicked, and my setup was clearing my table, grabbing the right tools, and, giving myself time. Same with the digital piece, right? The story of a character suspended between control and surrender. And a signal of this post is too safe, push it. And the setup of this is like, late night focus, notifications off. And I remember my Instagram was deactivated at that moment and iPad ready. Same with street photography, reading the story of the street, who's moving where, what might happen, and, following the signal when my body says, something's about to line up. And, creating a setup by picking the route, camera ready, settings dialed in. And, I was already using Arkhein site in my art. I'm just not aware, and I just wasn't using it in my own life. So here's how you start using this on yours. Pick one thing you've been avoiding. In your notes app, write 3 lines. Number 1 is story. My mind is saying blank. Number 2 is signal. My body feels blank and my blank. And number 3 is setup. My world makes this harder because blank. Just be honest with yourself. And look at those 3 lines and ask, if I changed just one of these a little this week, which one would free me the most? And that's Arkhein site, And let me remind you of this. You're not stuck, okay? You're structured. And when you can see the structure, like the story, signal, and setup, you can start carving motion out of your stillness on purpose. Now, if this hit you, run that 3-line exercise today and let me know in the comments which layer is the loudest for you right now. And yeah, man, that is just a part 1 of Arkhein motion. The art of carving motion from stillness.